stood fact. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Shelby Chestnut, a staff member at the Transgender Law Center. Before I begin, I just want to send a big thank you for convening all of these panelists today. TLC is the largest national trans-led organization in the United States advocating self-determination for all people. Grounded in legal expertise and committed to racial justice, TLC employs a variety of community-driven strategies to keep transgender and gender nonconforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation. In the last decade, transgender people and gender nonconforming people have gone from the shadows to the covers of magazines, courtrooms, and television. This increased visibility has also come with increased public debate, legislative attacks on the rights of transgender people, and sadly, deadly violence. Violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, especially transgender and gender nonconforming people, is one of the key civil rights issues of our time, and one that we can no longer ignore. In 2017, according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, we lost 28 transgender and gender nonconforming people across the United States to violence, a majority of whom were Black transgender women, making 2017 the deadliest year on record for transgender people. To date, in 2018, this epidemic continues with the murders of at least 8 transgender people. In a moment where society is seeing the increase in intersections of racism, misogyny, classism, and anti-LGBT policies on the state and federal level, it seems clear that addressing this violence transgender people are facing should be a top priority for everyone, especially the federal government, yet no one seems to be hearing the battle cry. Before we can look at solutions, we must understand some of the sources of this violence. Extreme discrimination in employment, education, and housing lead many trans people to see sex work as their best option to survive. But the criminalization of sex work and legislation like SESTA FOSTA makes sex work extremely dangerous for transgender people, contributing to the fatal violence people face. We must stop advancing policies that put the lives of sex workers in danger, and we must address the discrimination that limits opportunities for trans people and forces them into situations where they're vulnerable to trafficking and violence. Violence at the hands of law enforcement remains a persistent issue impacting the lives of trans people across the country. Law enforcement routinely profile transgender people, especially Black transgender women, and criminalize their survival. And worse, add to the violence and mistreatment when handling the homicides of transgender people and oftentimes misgendering them and perpetuating the narrative that they are criminal and deserving of deadly violence. Intimate partner violence, or domestic violence, while an epidemic in many people's lives in this country, is an issue of grave concern impacting many transgender people. Stigma and lack of public awareness that IPV can impact people regardless of their gender identity and sexual orientation oftentimes leaves transgender survivors with limited option for support, despite the fact that federal protections like the Violence Against Women Act includes LGBT survivors. State-sanctioned anti-trans legislation which seeks to dehumanize and limit trans people's access to public accommodations. Much of this legislation is known as the trans bathroom bills, seeks to limit people's access to public restrooms. Far beyond bathroom access, this type of legislation targets trans people's civil rights and opens up the floodgates for broader anti-trans legislation and increases violence towards trans people. We've seen it in North Carolina, Washington State, Texas, Anchorage, Alaska, and now Montana and Massachusetts. When we look at this source of violence and we start to think about solutions, it's clear we have a great deal of work to do to ensure that transgender and gender nonconforming people are central to this conversation. While state and federal hate crime laws were a hard-won battle, aiming to protect many vulnerable populations, we have done very little to increase public awareness for why LGBT people, especially transgender people, are in need of respect and legal protections. State and federal hate crime laws and prosecution are not the answer to protecting transgender communities from violence. Charging one person with a hate crime does nothing to prevent the next murder or increase public awareness on why transgender people are deserving of respect. To take this violence seriously, our country must look at solutions to address conditions transgender people face, especially state and federal elected officials who daily create laws and executive orders that strip transgender people of their rights and dignity. We must work towards a world that values transgender people, and one in which the media is uplifting their successes and contributions to society when they're alive and not dead. City, state, and federal funding must be made available to ensure transgender people have access to jobs, housing, education, and we must prioritize prevention programs that promote communities to be accepting and welcoming of transgender people versus criminalizing people. We must denounce the rollbacks and attacks of transgender people's rights and ensure protections like the Violence Against Women Act, HUD's Equal Access Rule, and all federal protections remain in place.
Muslims, transgender.
Right now, as we speak, hundreds of migrants in a highly publicized caravan wait at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking entry into the U.S. Among the caravan are a number of LGBT migrants, most of whom are trans women and minors who are fleeing violence in their countries of origin. The group was turned away from the port of entry for several days and experienced harassment and extreme violence in Mexico. This past weekend, the LGBT group was repeatedly turned away from refugee shelters due to transphobia and homophobia. After finally being allowed into a shelter, this group was awoken in the middle of the night by armed men who robbed them, threatened them, and then set the shelter on fire. Where's the public outcry for this horrific violence? Why isn't our government intervening? All of us should demand that Customs Border Patrol and Immigration Customs Enforcement allow the remaining members of this caravan entry immediately, or we risk them being killed.
They should intervene.
I want to close today by offering some of the highlights of the amazing work happening around the country to ensure transgender people are not only protected but thriving. Last year, TLC represented Ash Whitaker to challenge the Kenosha, Wisconsin School District, who denied him access to the boys' restroom in high school because he was transgender. We fought and won. Ash is now a freshman in college and living his authentic life. Last month in Anchorage, Alaska, transgender people worked with their allies to defeat an anti-trans bathroom measure despite high levels of opposition. Recently, national domestic and sexual violence advocates across the country called for the continued support for transgender rights and shared steps advocates can take locally to ensure transgender people have access to services and are respected when seeking services. Right here in our nation's capital, Ruby Corrado, a transgender Latina woman, runs Casa Ruby and provides housing and services to transgender people 365 days a year. In Montana,
Sorry, the time is up. Oh, thank you very much. Ms. Clark.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm here on behalf of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is one of the nation's oldest racial justice and civil rights